When it comes to the most iconic heroes in Tolkien's Legendarium, I think it's fair to say that most of them are heroic in a fairly straightforward sense of the word. I mean, Fëanor would probably be the exception. He is a terrible person. But for the most part, Tolkien's heroes are, I think, pretty heroic. But then there is Túrin, the hero of this story. The hero who, for a while, turned aside from heroism. The hero who dipped his toes into the waters of villainy. The hero who allows us to explore what happens when a good guy goes bad. Maya Govan and Melanin, and welcome to another installment in this series explaining and breaking down Tolkien's epic First Age tale of the Children of Húrin. In the last video, we explored Túrin's time among the elves of Doriath, his fostering by the High King Eleuthingol, his friendship with the epic elven warrior Beleg Cuthalion, and finally his self-imposed banishment after the accidental death of that super douchey elf, Saeros. After a trial in Túrin's absence, King Thingol forgave his wayward son, and wonderful Beleg Cuthalion volunteered to enter the wild to find his dear friend Túrin and to bring him back home to Doriath, where he belongs. But the wilds of Beleriand are as vast as they are perilous, and in these dark days of Morgoth's dominion, evil things now wander freely. So Beleg sets off on his quest to find the son of Húrin. But it is not an easy task. Túrin does not want to be found. And, believing himself an outlaw, to be hunted and hounded by both elves and servants of Morgoth, Túrin begins to live as one, an outcast in the wilderness and a fugitive from all. And so, it's that part of this story that I'm going to focus on in this video. But before I get into Túrin's actions as an outlaw of the waste, first I want to explore where in Beleriand this is taking place and what else is going on in this part of the world. So, after leaving Doriath in secret, Túrin journeyed here, to these woods south of the river Tyrglin, and south of the much larger forest of Brethiel. And if you've watched some of my previous videos, or if you're already familiar with this story, then you will know that the forest of Brethiel is home to the woodland-dwelling men of the House of Hulleth, also known as the Halathrim. But back before the disastrous Battle of Unnumbered Tears, some of these woodsmen lived in scattered homesteads south of the river, in this very part of Beleriand where Túrin now finds himself. By the time Túrin gets here, however, most, although not quite all, of these mannish communities are either abandoned or destroyed. The surviving Halathrim have, for the most part, fled deep into the forest of Brethiel to escape the cruel raids of their enemies. But, very interestingly, I think, it is not orcs that represent the primary threat from which these Halathrim settlers fled. Instead, the true enemy of these people are other men. Outlaws, bandits, men driven into the wild for evil deeds. They acquire their food through cruel robbery, and in the winter they are most feared, for they prey upon the Halathrim like wolves among sheep, and for that reason they become known among their foes as the Wolfmen, or in Sindarin, the Gaurwaith. But I think it's important to point out that these villainous Gaurwaith are not made up of, Morgoth-worshipping Easterlings. These aren't servants of the Dark Lord, they are in fact quite the opposite. These outlaws are men of the Edain, predominantly men of the House of Hador. They are kinsmen of Túrin's. They should be elf friends. They should be among the heroes in this story. But brutal times have forged brutal men, and need has driven them to dark deeds. Once upon a time, not too long ago, these men would have been subjects of the Noldorin kings, Fingolfin and Fingon. But that was then. Now they have fallen far. And among the other men of this region, the outcast Gawrwaith are hated scarcely less than orcs, for they are hard of heart and bear a particular grudge against their own kind. So, by the time they enter this story, the Gawrwaith number about 50 individuals, and they are led by an outlaw captain called Forweg, a deserter who fled from the Battle of Unnumbered Tears and now lives as a bandit in the wild. There are a few other named members of this outlaw band, but the one to introduce right now is known as Androg the Archer. And honestly, Androg is a particularly unusual character within Tolkien's writings. There are plenty of other morally grey characters in Middle-earth, but even among them, Androg is relatively unique. On the one hand, he absolutely is a villain. He has the hardest heart of all the Gawrwaith, and he began his life as an outlaw by straight up murdering some innocent woman of Dorlomin. Throughout this story, he will do plenty more incredibly dodgy things, and yet, bizarrely, he also demonstrates a decent amount of heroism, and he displays quite a few redeeming features. And yet, Androg isn't one of those characters who begins bad but then finds redemption and fundamentally changes into a better person. Instead, I would say that the good and the bad coexist in Androg simultaneously, and I don't think that one cancels out the other. I imagine that as this story moves forward, there will be moments when you think of Androg as an indisputable villain, but then there will come other moments that might make you reevaluate that. He truly is one of the most morally complex characters in this story, and considering that the main character of this story is Túrin, son of Húrin, that's saying a lot. Anyway, speaking of Túrin, it is whilst he is wandering these woods south of the river Tyagleen that he first comes face to face with these wolf men of the wild. When the scouts of the Gawrwaith spot a tall man entering their territory with elven mail beneath his cloak and an elvish blade at his side, they ambush him. And Túrin suddenly finds himself surrounded by a circle of men with bent bows and drawn swords. Túrin halts, and yet he shows no fear. The first of the Gawrwaith to address him is their captain Forweg, and he says to Túrin, "These are our haunts, and my men do not allow other men to walk in them. We take their lives as forfeit, unless they can ransom them." But to this, Túrin laughs grimly. "You will get no ransom from me. You may search me when I'm dead, but it may cost you dearly. Many of you are likely to die first." Which is a ballsy thing to say, considering that Túrin is surrounded by archers at this moment, and not one of his foes is within range of his sword, but Túrin's proud words anger the outlaws, and he feels that death is drawing near. One of the Gawrwaith aims an arrow at Túrin's face, and he looses it before Forweg can give the command. But as this arrow leaves the bow, Túrin stoops to the ground. He picks up a stone and he hurls it at the outlaw's head. The arrow misses its mark, but Túrin's stone was thrown with great force and true aim. Within a second of shooting his arrow, the archer drops dead with a broken skull. "I might be more service to you alive," Túrin says to Forweg and the other outlaws, "in the place of that luckless man." Now, there are some among the Gawrwaith who despise Túrin for killing one of their own, but the Captain Forweg agrees that the archer should not have loosed his arrow before being given the command, and when Túrin offers to fight all the outlaws who want him dead, all the outlaws back down. The Gawrwaith are wild and dangerous men, but not one of them can do what Túrin can do. And they begin to recognize that letting him join their ranks would be of far greater benefit than giving their own lives just to kill him. And so, the first of the Gawrwaith to welcome Túrin into their outlaw band is that fascinatingly complicated guy, Arndrog the Archer. He says, for all to hear, "I am not a chicken heart, as men know, but I am not your match. You may join us, for my part, but there is a strange light in your eyes. You are a dangerous man. What is your name?" And in answering that question, Túrin gives us the first of his many adopted names. He does not introduce himself as Túrin, instead he calls himself Nathan, which in Sindarin means the wronged. And it is by this name, Nathan, that Túrin becomes known to the Gawrwaith for the rest of his time among them. He joins their group, and he does so by replacing that guy that he just killed with his stone. The particulars of his past and his true identity are never shared with any of the outlaws, but in short time they begin to depend upon this mysterious Nathan. They even begin to like him, and he soon won their praise, for he was strong and valiant, and had more skill in the woods than they, and they trusted him, for he was not greedy, and took little thought for himself. But the outlaws also feared Túrin, for he would sometimes display sudden anger, and his moods were seldom understood. And so, as summer passed into autumn, and then into fading, and then into winter, Túrin abode in the wild with the Gawrwaith. And although they aren't even close to being, good people, the company of any men made the wild more easy to endure, and because he wished to live, and could not forever be at strife with them, he did little to restrain their evil deeds. Thus Túrin soon became hardened to a mean and often cruel life. And yet at times pity and disgust would wake in him, and then he was perilous in his anger. It would seem that for this period of his life, Túrin is trying tremendously hard to pick a precarious path between heroism and villainy. He is, I think, a good man, but he's going along with bad things, and he's surrounding himself with complicated people. Anyway, when this cruel winter stirred into spring, the desperation of the Gawrwaith diminished a little bit, and they became less reliant on plundering the homesteads of the Halathrim for their food. During the bitterest days of winter, the Halathrim actually used to leave food for the Gawrwaith to find in the hopes that it would dissuade these violent raids. But the famished Gawrwaith were cruel to the woodsmen nonetheless, and so, by spring, the woodsmen began to fight back. The woods became perilous for the outlaws, and lingering near the homesteads of the Halathrim began to seem to Túrin like a really bad idea. There is way more food and way less danger in the south where no men live, but for some reason Fordweg is keeping the Gawrwaith strangely close to the lands of the Halathrim. And I think there's something very, very interesting to be said about Túrin's characterization in this part of the story. By now he's spent about 6 or 7 months with the Gawrwaith, and although he seldom prevents his fellow outlaws from doing evil, he himself does not take part in it. And by now, I think it can be argued that Túrin is beginning to resent some of their more malicious actions. Don't forget, Túrin's father, Húrin, was the grandson of the Lord of the Halathrim. And so, albeit distantly, these woodsmen are very much Túrin's kin. And I just don't think Túrin can, in good conscience, allow them to suffer any longer at the hands of his companions. To an extent, I think Túrin's personality seems to change with the seasons. During the desperate winter, he is cold and hard and as bitter as the land he lives in, but when spring comes again, we see a softer and gentler side to him. Anyway, one sunny day in spring, Túrin is sat with the outlaws wondering why Fordweg hasn't yet moved them on further into the south. But then he notices that neither Fordweg nor his sort of friend Androg are present. Another outlaw tells Túrin that they'll be back soon, but Túrin swiftly tires of waiting in the Gawrwaith's squalid camp, so he takes himself off for a walk in the woods. And as he wanders alone in these woods, his mind begins to wander too. And eventually it turns back to Doriath. He doesn't want to think about his former home, he tries to force it out of his mind, but against his will, he remembered the hidden kingdom, and he seemed to hear the names of the flowers of Doriath as echoes of an old tongue almost forgotten. I guess you can take the hero out of Doriath, but you can't take the Doriath out of our hero. Against his own will, happy memories are stirring in Túrin's mind. But then he hears a cry coming from the undergrowth. He draws his sword and suddenly a young woman comes running from a hazel thicket in great fear, her skin and clothes torn by thorns. She falls at Túrin's feet, and as she does so, a large man bursts out behind her from the thicket, chasing after her. Túrin steps between the woman and her attacker, and with a single stroke of his sword, he delivers justice, killing the man before he could lay hands upon the woman. But only then does Túrin realize who it was that he'd just slain. This assailant was none other than Captain Fordweg. A moment later, Androg emerges from the thicket, and he sees the blood of Fordweg upon the grass and upon Túrin's blade. "Evil work, Nathan," he cried, drawing his sword, but Túrin's mood ran cold. "Where are the orcs then?" he asks. "Have you outrun them to help her?" "Orcs?" says Androg. "Fool! You call yourself an outlaw. Outlaws know no law but their needs. Look to your own, Nathan, and leave us to mind ours." But to this, Túrin simply replies, "You will leave this woman to me, or you will join Fordweg." Androg laughs, but backs down. He's been saying for months that he can't match Túrin in a contest of arms, but he does warn Túrin that the other outlaws may take the slaying of Fordweg pretty badly. However, before Túrin can respond to that, the woman that Fordweg was chasing rises to her feet, puts a hand on Túrin's arm, and stares at the blood on his blade. And there was delight in her eyes. "Kill him, Lord," she says. "Kill him too, and then come with me. If you bring their heads, Larnak my father will not be displeased. For 2 wolf heads he has rewarded men well." And so, Túrin has a choice to make. This is his opportunity to regain the honour that he's lost, and to end his days as an outlaw by slaying his former friend and delivering his head to this Larnak guy, a chieftain of the Halathrim, one of Túrin's kin. And yet, Túrin refuses. He tells Larnak's daughter that he will not cut off the heads of his fellows to buy any favour from her father, and he sends her back to her home alone. And I find this scene really interesting, because we see 2 equally intense, yet kinda contradictory facets of Túrin's personality on show here. On the one hand, Fordweg was just killed due to Túrin's intense sense of justice, yet Androg was spared due to his equally intense sense of loyalty. In the end, Túrin tells Androg to bury Fordweg if he wishes to, but whilst Androg is doing that, Túrin returns to the rest of the outlaws and he tells them in no uncertain terms that their captain is dead and that he was the one who did it. And so Túrin demands that the outlaws choose a new captain, and he nominates himself as the obvious candidate. He says, "These choices I give you. You must take me as your captain in Fordweg's place, or else let me go. But if you wish to kill me, set to. I will fight you all until I am dead, or you." Now, some of the outlaws do go for their weapons, but before they can avenge Fordweg, Androg returns to their camp and he tells them to stop. He explains how Túrin refused to betray them to the Halathrim of Larnak, and he tells his men, "The head that he spared is not witless. If we fight, more of us will die needlessly before we kill the best man among us." After hearing Androg's words, the rest of the outlaws repent, and they accept Neathan as their new captain. And so, for the second time in only about 6 months, Túrin rises through the ranks of the Gawrwaith by killing one of their number and then taking his place. But Túrin does not lead the outlaws in the same way that Fordweg did. After being declared their new captain, a thought came to Túrin that from this small band, he might rise to build himself a free lordship of his own. He says to the Gawrwaith, "Do you take me as your captain? Then I will lead you first away into the wild, far from the homes of men. There we may find better fortune or not, but at least we shall earn less hatred of our own kind." In other words, Túrin intends to redeem these outlaws, to take a violent gang of bandits and to reform them into a fighting force of his own. No longer shall they be enemies of men. Instead, now the Gawrwaith shall follow Túrin into the south, where they will make amends for their violence by focusing that violence exclusively upon the servants of Morgoth. Under the command of their new captain Neathan the Wronged, the Wolfmen of the Wild are turning into hunters of the enemy. But that is where I'm going to leave Túrin and the Gawrwaith for just a moment, because whilst all of that is going on, there is another subplot taking place simultaneously, and that is the tale of the quest of Beleg Cuthalion to find his beloved buddy Túrin wherever he may be, and to bring him home to Doriath. So, Thingol actually sent out a good number of scouts from his woodland realm to search for Túrin in the wild, but as winter began to bite, they began to lose hope, and eventually they all returned to Doriath in vain. All except for Beleg Cuthalion. He went on alone. But Beleg's love for Túrin does come at a cost. In the last video, I talked about how Túrin spent his adolescence with Beleg up in the contested land of Dimbar, and together the strong bow and the dragon helm battled the invading orcs and made safe the north marches of Doriath. However, now neither the dragon helm nor the strong bow are present in Dimbar, and so the servants of Morgoth were heartened and increased ever in numbers and in daring. When spring came again, the orcs renewed their assault, and in the absence of Beleg and Túrin, Dimbar was eventually overrun by evil things, which is particularly terrible news for the woodsmen of Brethiel, the Halathrim of this region, who now have to live with the constant terror of Morgoth's minions, gathering their strength on the other side of the river Brethiarch. Anyway, almost a full year after Túrin departed from Doriath, Beleg was still searching for him, and his quest brought him to the crossings of the river Tyregleen, where he heard the ill news that a great host of orcs were marching down from Taur Nufuin. That's the evil forest under Nightshade, where, fun fact, Sauron is currently hiding out in a vampire's form. And so, Beleg decides to take a short break from his quest to find Túrin, and he journeys down to the last of the southern homesteads of the Halathrim in order to warn those that remain of the incoming orcs. And just so happens that this community of woodsmen, one of the last in this region where Beleg finds himself, is the very same community that is governed by that Larnak guy. And in Larnak's homestead, Beleg hears strange tales told about a man who was so tall and lordly that some of the Halathrim believed he must have been an elvish warrior. He had dark hair and bright eyes, and he killed the captain of the Gawrwaith to save Larnak's daughter. Yet, when Beleg goes to Larnak and his daughter to hear from them all he can of this strange story, Larnak's daughter tells him that although this mysterious man with the elvish blade rescued her and slew her attacker, he also called the wolfmen his fellows and would not slay another that stood by him and knew his name. Nathan, they called him. From this very limited information, Beleg is able to guess the answer to the riddle. So he departs from the homestead of Larnak, but before he goes, he warns the woodsman of the tide of evil that is coming down from the north. He says to Larnak, "Soon the orcs will come ravening in this country in strength too great for you to withstand. This year at least you must give up your freedom or your lives. Go to Brethiel while there is time." After that, Beleg hastens away into the south, with the hope of tracking Túrin, or at least finding signs that might point him towards the lair of the outlaws. They're only a few days ahead of Beleg, but under Túrin's command, the Gawrwaith have become considerably better at evading detection. And fearing the pursuit of the woodsman, Túrin used all the arts that he knew to defeat or mislead any that tried to follow him. And so Túrin led his Gawrwaith west, away from the homes of the Halathrim and away from the borders of Doriath, into the vast empty highlands between the rivers Sirion and Narog. And Beleg followed, led by the rumour of the passing of men among the wild things with whom he could speak. But although he often came very close to finding them, the outlaws' lairs were always just abandoned by the time he got to them, and in the end Beleg declares in his frustration, "Alas, too well did I teach this child of men craft in wood and field." An elvish band, almost, one might think this to be. But Beleg never gives up, and eventually the Gawrwaith themselves become acutely aware that they are being tracked by some unknown but utterly tireless pursuer. They can't see him, they don't know who he is, but they cannot shake him off. Anyway, exactly as Beleg forewarned, it isn't long at all before those orcs from Húrin crossed the river Brithiach and became a very, very real threat to the Halathrim. As it goes, Larnak did indeed take heed of Beleg's warning, and he sent many of the women and children of his community up into the deepest parts of the forest of Brethiel, where they would hopefully be protected by the chieftain of all, the House of Haleth, a great warrior called Handir, who just so happens to be the cousin of Túrin's father. When the orcs tried to cross the river, Handir and the fullest force that he could muster resisted them, and they ultimately forced the orcs out of their forest and into the south, towards Larnak's community. The women and the children of this area did make it to Brethiel in time, and they were thus spared the plundering of the orcs, but Larnak's fighting men who stayed behind to defend their homesteads, they were not so fortunate. We aren't actually given any specifics on the fate of Larnak himself, but the evidence seems to suggest that along with the rest of his fighters, Larnak was either killed by the orcs in this battle or captured by them after it. Either way, when the fighting was done, the orcs passed on to the homesteads and sacked them and burned them. And once the violence was done, the orcs returned back north as swiftly as they could, carrying their captives and their plunder back to Angband. I don't want to dwell too long on them right now, but do try to remember Handir and his surviving Halathrim of Brethiel as this story moves forward. There's a very easy to miss, but consistently very important subplot concerning these woodsmen and their conflicts with Morgoth's servants that will run throughout the entirety of the story and in the end will become extremely relevant. Anyway, the real reason that I'm focusing on this orc warband and the captive woodsmen of Larnak's community is because their torment at the hands of these evil creatures segues us wonderfully back to Túrin and the Gawrwaith. Honestly, we are actually told that although the scouts of the Gawrwaith very swiftly learn about these mannish captives being dragged off by orcs to suffer the horrors of Angband, most of the outlaws themselves don't really care too much about, like, doing the right thing, you know, saving their fellow Edain from unspeakable hardship, but they do care very much about the plunder of the woodsmen that they could take for themselves by simply slaying the orcs. Except for Túrin himself. He is not motivated by greed. Instead, he is primarily motivated by an indomitable hatred of Morgoth. And so, in Túrin's mind, it seems pretty perilous for the Gawrwaith to reveal themselves to this orc company without first learning, like, how many of the enemy there are and what their strength is. Perhaps unsurprisingly, though, most of the outlaws disagree with the wisdom of their new captain, and so Túrin sets out with only one companion to do this reconnaissance himself, and then to report back to the rest of the outlaws what he's found out. In his absence, Túrin declares that the command of the Gawrwaith should pass to his kind of friend, Arndrog the Archer, and he tells them to lie close and well hid until he returns from spying on the orcs. So, Túrin sets off with this single companion, whose name is Orleg, and together they sneakily scout the lands that the orcs are passing through. However, Túrin and Orleg soon learn that this orc warband is far larger than they anticipated, and also far warier of danger. Turns out that the orcs had many scouts of their own, and they went creeping through the trees searching for anyone or anything that might be a threat to them. We don't often think of orcs as being particularly vigilant or disciplined when it comes to, like, self-preservation, but there is a very good reason why these orcs are so afraid of their surroundings. In order to get back to Angband, the orcs must first cross the river Tyrglin, and to do that they must follow the Old South Road to the crossings. But even in these days of Morgoth's apparent victory, there are still some parts of Beleriand where orcs fear to go. And this Old South Road that they are forced to take brings them dangerously close to this area, Talath Dirnen, the empty, guarded plain that lies between the wild and that other, secret, underground, elvish stronghold where a good few of Morgoth's enemies still dwell safely beyond his reach, within the hidden kingdom of Nargothrond. And the reason that Nargothrond remains hidden from the enemy and a danger to his servants is because these guarded lands all about it are routinely patrolled and watched over by the super secretive spies and scouts of the Elven King in Nargothrond. And so, whilst Túrin and that Orleg guy are sneakily spying on the orcs themselves are sneakily spying on the surrounding area. Before too long, 3 of those orc scouts come prowling through the woods, and there they stumble upon Túrin and Orleg. Túrin cuts down 2 of the orcs immediately, but the 3rd one escapes, and it rushes off to raise the alarm. Interestingly though, the word that this orc scout cries out as he runs back to his warband to warn them of Túrin and Orleg is Golug. And Golug is an orcish name for the Noldor. This is neither the first nor the last time in his life that Túrin will be mistaken for some great elvish warrior. Anyway, within moments of this scout's escape, the forest is filled with orcs who scatter silently amid the trees and stalk far and wide in search of Túrin and his companion. Swiftly, Túrin realizes that there are simply too many enemies, and evading them seems impossible, but they can at least deceive the orcs and lead them away from where the rest of the outlaws are camped. So, Túrin and Oleg run west, away from the lair of the Gawrwaith and towards the perilous elvish lands of Nargothrond. The orcs pursue them, and though the two outlaws are swift, they are soon driven out of the woods and onto the open plain. And as Túrin and Oleg flee across the Old South Road, both of them are shot by the orcs. Oleg is struck down by many arrows and he falls dead upon the road. Túrin is struck too, but he is saved by his elvish mail. And though he is lost, wounded, and alone, he manages to escape into these strangely unfamiliar lands. Through a combination of swiftness and guile and woodcraft, Túrin is able to avoid the rest of the orcs, but he is unable to save the captive Halathrim of Larnak's people. Fearing that Túrin might be the first in a host of elvish warriors out of Nargothrond, the orcs lose their nerve. And rather than carrying their captives onwards to Angband, instead they simply cut their losses and murder every last one of the prisoners. Which I think is potentially quite a good early example of Morgoth's curse twisting and manipulating Túrin's actions towards the worst possible outcome. At this moment in the story, Túrin demonstrates wisdom in his insistence that the outlaws determine the orcs' strength before launching an attack. If he hadn't done this, all the Gawrwaith would most likely have been overwhelmed and killed. He demonstrates honour by volunteering himself to be the one to do the scouting. If he'd sent others to do it, they wouldn't have been protected by his elvish mail and thus wouldn't have survived the arrows. And he demonstrates intelligence by leading the orcs west towards Nargothrond instead of back east towards the lair of the outlaws. Túrin's actions here are motivated entirely by positive traits, and yet through no real fault of his own, the consequence of these actions is the murder of all the captives. I suppose it could certainly be argued that death on the road is a kinder fate than slavery in Angband, but even so, this is such a dark outcome, and it is a direct result of Túrin's actions, but I really can't think of anything that he actually did wrong here. He was brave, he was honourable, he was intelligent, and yet everything ended awfully anyway, due to the curse of Morgoth. Now, I will of course return to Túrin, but he spends 3 days recovering from his injuries and slowly making his way back to the cave of the Gawrwaith, and in that time, something very important happens among the outlaws. That grey figure, the mysterious shadow that's been pursuing them for almost a year now, finally catches up to them. Whilst waiting for Túrin and Oleg's return, some of the Gawrwaith suggest abandoning their new captain and moving on to greener pastures where they will hopefully be safer. But Androg the Archer speaks against this, and as the leader in Túrin's absence, he insists that they patiently await the return of Nathan. However, it's in the midst of this debate that the stranger shows up in the outlaws' camp. Beleg Cuthalion has found them at last. He wields no weapon, and he holds up his palms in an elvish gesture of peace. But the Gawrwaith are nowhere near as honourable as he is, and so before Beleg can speak a word, Androg comes up behind him. He casts a noose around Beleg's arms, and he draws it so tight that the elf cannot move. But in response to this highly dishonourable mistreatment, Beleg demonstrates an amazing degree of coolness. As the outlaws bind him and make him their prisoner, Beleg simply says, "If you do not wish for guests, you should keep a better watch. Why do you welcome me thus? I come as a friend, seeking only a friend? Nathan, I hear that you call him." But Androg has no interest in being nice to the elf, and he considers the fact that Beleg knows the name Nathan to be proof that he is a spy, and that he is indeed the shadow that's been hounding the outlaws for a year. And so Androg orders that Beleg be tied to a tree, where he is aggressively interrogated by the Gawrwaith. But to each and every one of their questions, Beleg's answer is always the same. "A friend I have been to this Nathan since I first met him in the woods, and he was then but a child. I seek him only in love, and to bring good tidings." But to this, Androg replies by escalating the situation tenfold. He says in wrath, "Let us slay him, and be rid of his spying." Although we are actually told that Androg the archer had a specific agenda whilst speaking these words. He looks upon Beleg's mighty elven bow, Belthronding, and he covets it, knowing that if Beleg were to be killed, Belthronding would pass to him. However, among the Gawrwaith there is a relatively nicer outlaw of better heart called Arlagund. And from the beginning, Arlagund has always been a supporter of Túrin's. He actually referred to Túrin as the best man among us after Túrin killed Forweg. Anyway, after Beleg is tied to the tree, this Arlagund guy speaks out against Androg, and he tells him the captain, Túrin, may return yet, and then you will rue it if he learns that he has been robbed at once of a friend and of good tidings. Androg doesn't believe that Beleg is a friend, and he doesn't care too much for the wisdom of Arlagund, but his instincts of self-preservation do keep him from murdering Beleg right then and there. So Androg decides instead that Beleg should be left, just tied to the tree with no food and no water until he gives the outlaws a reason to let him live. But to this, all Beleg says is, "I shall wait for your captain." And so, for 2 days, Beleg is just left standing there, tied to a tree with nothing to eat and nothing to drink. But as time moves on and those 2 days pass into the 3rd night, Beleg is still totally calm and cool in his captivity, but the Gawrwaith are starting to become angry and fearful. And as the darkness draws down upon them, they begin to believe that it's been too long. Túrin ain't coming back. And so their only option is to kill this spying elf, take a new captain, and then find a new hideout somewhere in the wild. However, before Beleg is to be executed, a particularly unpleasant outlaw called Ularad has the idea to torture Beleg in the hope that he might reveal some last piece of information that the Gawrwaith can use to their benefit. So, Ularad lifts a burning branch from the fire and he approaches Beleg with the intent to sear his skin and to brand him. But it is in that very moment, as Ularad raises the burning branch, that Túrin finally returns to the outlaws' camp. And the first thing he sees as he silently draws near is the haggard face of his dearest friend in the light of Ularad's brand. His friend who's about to be tortured by his followers. And as Túrin looks upon his beloved Beleg, who he never got a chance to say goodbye to, nor ever believed that he would see again, he was stricken as with a shaft. And as if at the sudden melting of frost, tears long unshed filled his eyes. He leaps out of the bushes, rushes to Beleg's side, and cuts the bonds about his wrists. When the Gawderwyth explain their actions and why they were about to torture this stranger, Túrin is initially furious. But very, very interestingly, when his mood has cooled off a bit and he spent a good bit of time tending to Beleg and trying to heal him, his anger turned upon himself. For often strangers had been slain when caught near the lairs of the outlaws, and he had not hindered it. And often he himself had spoken ill of King Thingol and the Grey Elves, so that he must share the blame if they were treated as foes. While Beleg is recovering overnight, Túrin has words with his Gawderwyth. He says to them, "You were cruel, and cruel without need. Never until now have we tormented a prisoner, but to this orc work such a life as we lead has brought us. Lawless and fruitless have all our deeds been, serving only ourselves and feeding hate in our hearts." Androg the archer responds to his captain by saying, "But whom shall we serve if not ourselves? Whom shall we love when all hate us?" To which Túrin answers, "At least my hands shall not again be raised against elves or men. Angband has servants enough." And this conversation is, in my mind, another great example of why I defend Túrin despite his occasionally questionable decisions. In this conversation, he demonstrates humility, he demonstrates a willingness to accept responsibility for his own misdeeds, and he demonstrates a huge amount of personal growth. First thing I will draw attention to is Túrin's use of the phrase orc work. This is, of course, the exact same piece of language that Marblung the Hunter used in the last video to describe Túrin's treatment of that douchebag elf, Sairos. Back then, Túrin brushed off the criticism, and he basically says, "Nah, it's only orc play." But a year later, he has grown up enough to recognize that these misdeeds are indeed orc work, and he can no longer look past that. I also want to point out the number of times Túrin uses the words we, us, or our while telling off the Gawderwyth. He doesn't just have a go at them while denying any responsibility on his own part. He totally acknowledges that he is not exempt from criticism, and that all of them did bad things. All of them need to reckon with that, and all of them have some atoning to do. And he also recognizes that the life of an outlaw is simply not conducive to being a hero and doing good things. The life they are living has fed hatred in their hearts, and that needs to change. After openly declaring, "My hand shall not again be raised against elves or men, Angband has servants enough," Túrin goes on to say, "If others will not take this vow with me, I will walk alone." But as he says this, Beleg opens an eye and raises his head, and he says, "Not alone." Before all of the Gawderwyth, Beleg tells Túrin everything that he came to tell. "You are no outlaw. Such fault as was found in you is pardoned. The dragon helm has been missed too long." Now, most people, I think, would be happy to hear this news, but Túrin is not most people. And having just said all of that about Túrin's growth and his acceptance of personal responsibility, he is still a little bit of an absolute idiot, for at Beleg's words, a shadow fell upon him again. He has every opportunity to return to Doriath and to be a knight of King Eleuthingol's realm once again, the thing he originally wanted, to do battle beside Beleg on the marches of Dimbar once again. But when this offer is made, he says, "Let this night pass, then I will choose." By next morning, Beleg is totally healed of all his pains, being a mighty elf and a master healer, and so he seeks out Túrin, and the two of them share a lovely, yet simultaneously unbelievably frustrating conversation as friends. They talk about Túrin's last day in Doriath, the day that Cyrus died. They talk about Thingol's love for Túrin, and Beleg says to him, begs him, "Surely you will return now to Doriath." But Túrin still hangs back. "My man's heart was proud," he says, "as the Elf King said, and so it still is, Beleg Cuthalion. Not yet will it suffer me to go back to Menegroth and bear looks of pity and pardon as for a wayward boy amended. I should give pardon, not receive it, and I am a boy no longer, but a man according to my kind, and a hard man by my fate." "A hard man, if by that you mean stubborn," Beleg replies, which I think is hilarious. But as frustrating as Túrin's pride may be, I do actually kind of get where he's coming from here. Beleg is saying that Túrin is pardoned, and he is free to return to Doriath with honor, but that same offer is not extended to the Gaudawaith. If Túrin did return to King Thingol's woodland realm, he would have to leave his outlaws behind him. And without him as their captain, Túrin is very reasonably confident that they will eventually fall back to their old ways and return to doing evil against the innocent. But if Túrin remains, if Neathan continues to lead them, perhaps the Gaudawaith truly can be redeemed. Túrin says to Beleg, "The grace of Thingol will not stretch to receive these companions of my fall, but I will not part with them now. I love them, in my own way, even the worst a little. They are of my own kind, and there is some good in each that might grow." Now, Beleg doesn't see it. He has just spent days being mistreated and tortured and very nearly straight up murdered by the Gaudawaith, and he has a particular distrust of Androg, whom Beleg sees as the ringleader of these less than wonderful outlaws. But he doesn't tell Túrin any of the details of Androg's malice, for he perceives that there is some sort of a friendship between Túrin and Androg, and Beleg fears that telling Túrin the truth may end up only hurting their old friendship and driving Túrin back towards his darker instincts. Also, although we know that Túrin is cursed by Morgoth, and it is fated that chance will always turn against him, Túrin himself, at this point in the story, does not know that. He has no reason to believe that his decisions are destined to always go awry, and I think this is yet another example of Túrin making a potentially poor choice that is almost entirely motivated by positive intentions. There is definitely some pride at play, but I think the through line of Túrin's reasoning here is an intent to redeem his companions and a will to do the right thing. Anyway, Túrin tells Beleg, "I would lead my own men and make war in my own way, but in this at least my heart is changed. I repent every stroke save those dealt against the enemy of men and elves. And above all else I would have you beside me. Stay with me." But Beleg replies, If I stayed beside you, love would lead me, not wisdom. Let us return to Dimbar, where once we walked together. We are needed there. Dimbar, which used to lie in peace, is falling under the dark hand, and the men of Brethiel are troubled. To Dimbar I call you. But Túrin says no. He will not go back in life, and he has his sights set upon a different battlefield. Just to the south of where the outlaws are currently camped is a hill called Amon Ruth, which I will talk a lot more about in the next video. But this lone hill in an otherwise empty land has immense strategic value, and that is where Túrin intends to build a permanent stronghold. And so this reunion of Beleg and Túrin ends at an impasse. Beleg basically says to Túrin, if you want us to be together, you have to come with me to Dimbar. And Túrin basically says, no, if you want us to be together, you have to come with me to Amon Ruth. In the end, neither friend is willing to budge. Túrin says to Beleg, look for me on Amon Ruth, else this is our last farewell. To which Beleg replies, maybe that is best. Now, don't worry, this isn't actually their last farewell, but it is a temporary farewell. Beleg departs from Túrin and he returns all the way back to Doriath. Firstly, to inform King Thingol of everything that's happened in the year since he's been gone, and secondly, to do the thing that he was so desperate to get Túrin to do. Beleg returns to Dimbar. Beleg saves the woodsman. Beleg leads the warriors of Doriath, and he resists the onslaught of Morgoth. And that is where I'm going to have to end this video, but in the next one I will continue the tale of Túrin and the Gaurwaith. I will continue the tale of Beleg and his battles, and I will introduce a new wrinkle into this story, a fascinating dwarven character called Meme. And Meme is destined to take this tale into an even darker direction. So, to make sure you don't miss that, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to click like and leave a comment if you enjoyed this video. However, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Navair Melanin.